You know what finally made me rethink everything I thought I knew about milling lumber? I was at a traditional timber framing workshop in northern Minnesota about 4 years ago, and there was a Scandinavian fellow there demonstrating how Viking shipwrights turned raw oak logs into planks. No sawmill, no bandsaw, just wedges, a mallet, and a broadaxe. And I stood there watching him take a crooked 20-inch oak log and turn it into a plank that was flatter than anything my local mill has ever handed me. I ran my hand across that surface, and I could not believe it. It was smoother than sawn lumber, stronger than sawn lumber, and he did it with a tool that most of us think belongs in a museum. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly how the Vikings used a broadaxe to shape massive logs into precision planks, why the wood they produced was actually superior to what comes off a modern sawmill, and how you can start using these methods yourself. Plus, stick around to the end because I have a bonus tip about reading growth rings before you split that will save you from wasting good logs. Let us get into it. What we are really talking about today is a woodworking system that dominated Northern Europe for centuries and produced some of the most impressive wooden structures and vessels ever built. And the remarkable thing is how simple the core principles are once you understand them. So let me start with where this all comes from. The Norse shipwrights and timber framers, who worked from roughly the 8th century through the 11th century, were not primitive craftsmen swinging crude tools. These were people who built ocean-going longships that crossed the North Atlantic in open water. The Gokstad ship, which was excavated in Norway and dates to around 870 AD, was built almost entirely from hand-split and hand-hewn oak planks. Those planks were thin enough to flex with the waves, but strong enough to survive storms that would tear apart a rigid hull. And here is what stopped me in my tracks when I first learned this. Many of those planks survived over 1,000 years buried in clay, and when they were uncovered, the wood was still structurally sound. The staved churches of Norway tell the same story. Some of them have been standing since the 1100s, with original hewn timbers still in service. The reason all of this worked comes down to one guiding principle that shaped everything these craftsmen did. They never cut across the grain if they could possibly avoid it. Every step in their process, from felling the tree to finishing the surface, was designed to keep the natural grain fibers intact from one end of the board to the other. That single idea is the foundation of everything I am about to show you, and once you understand it, you will never look at a sawn board the same way again. The first method I want to walk you through is how these craftsmen read a log and split it along the grain, because this is where the whole process begins and where most of the magic actually happens. When a Viking shipwright looked at a fresh-felled oak log, he was not thinking about how to cut it into boards. He was thinking about how the tree wanted to come apart naturally. Every log has medullary rays running from the center of the trunk outward toward the bark. These are like the spokes of a wheel, and they represent natural planes of weakness in the wood. The craftsman would study the end grain of the log, find where those rays were strongest and most evenly spaced, and that told them exactly where to place their wedges. They would start by driving iron or hardwood wedges into the end grain along one of those ray lines, working from the center outward. The log would begin to split along its own natural structure, not where the craftsman forced it to go, but where the wood itself wanted to separate. With green white oak, which was the primary species for shipbuilding, a skilled worker could split a 20-inch diameter log into halves, then quarters, then individual planks, each one following the grain perfectly from end to end. Here is why that matters so much. When you split wood this way, which is called riving, every single grain fiber in that plank runs continuously from one end to the other. Nothing is severed. Nothing is interrupted. Compare that to a sawmill, where the blade cuts through fibers at whatever angle the log happens to be oriented. A riven plank of white oak can be bent into a curve that would snap a sawn plank of the same species and thickness. I have seen it with my own eyes, and it still amazes me every time. Now, once you have a riven blank that is roughly the shape you want, the next step is where the broadaxe comes in, and this is the method that really changed how I think about working wood. The broadaxe is not a felling axe. It is a completely different tool designed for a completely different job. A felling axe has a symmetrical bevel on both sides and a straight handle. A broadaxe has a single bevel on one side, a flat cheek on the other, and an offset handle that curves away from the flat face. That offset is critical. It lets you stand on top of the log or beside it and swing the axe so the flat cheek rides right along the surface you are creating, like a hand plane riding on its sole. The technique works in two stages. First, you make score cuts across the face of the log, roughly every 4 to 6 inches apart, chopping down to your layout line at an angle. These do not have to be pretty. They are just establishing depth. Then you come back and knock out the waste between those score cuts, working with the grain so the chips pop out cleanly. What you are left with is a rough step surface that is close to flat but still has ridges. That is when you take your finishing passes. With a freshly sharpened broadaxe, you stand so the flat cheek is against the wood and take long, controlled strokes that shave off those ridges and leave a smooth, flat face. When it is done right, the surface looks like it was hit with a number 7 jointer plane. The first time I managed a clean finishing pass on a piece of green oak, I just stood there staring at it. The surface had this luminous quality that sanded wood never has, because the fibers were burnished and intact, rather than torn and scratched. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third method is putting it all together to hew a flat face on a full-length timber, and this is where you really start to appreciate how systematic these Norse craftsmen were. They did not just wail away at a log and hope for the best. They used layout lines snapped with a chalked string, the same way timber framers still do today. They would snap a line down the length of the log on both ends, establishing exactly where the finished surface needed to be. Then they would snap connecting lines along the length so they had a visual reference for every stroke. The scoring cuts go in first, every 4 to 6 inches, angled down to that chalk line but never past it. You are removing the bulk of the waste in this stage, and it goes fast, especially in green wood. A sharp axe in green-white oak feels almost like cutting butter. The chips fly off in thick curls, and the smell is incredible, this sharp tannic scent that you never get from kiln-dried lumber. Once the waste is scored and knocked out, you switch your grip and your stance for the finishing passes. Your feet are planted parallel to the timber, the flat cheek of the broadaxes, riding against the emerging surface, and you are taking thin, even shavings. An experienced hewer can hold a tolerance of about 1/16 of an inch over an 8-foot length. That is not as precise as a thickness planer, but it is more than adequate for timber framing, boat building, furniture, or any structural work. And the resulting surface is genuinely beautiful in a way that machined surfaces simply are not. Now let me explain the science behind why riven and hewn wood is structurally superior to sawn wood, because this is not just tradition or nostalgia. This is material science. When a sawmill blade passes through a log, it cuts through grain fibers at whatever angle they happen to cross the blade path. In a typical flat sawn board, you might have fibers running at 5, 10, even 15 degrees off the face of the board. Every one of those severed fibers is a tiny weak point. Under bending stress, cracks propagate along those severed fibers. Under moisture cycling, water enters along those exposed end grain channels and accelerates swelling, shrinking, and decay. A riven plank has none of those problems. Every fiber runs parallel to the face from end to end. There are no severed fibers to initiate cracks. There are no exposed end grain channels for moisture to enter. The result is a board that is dramatically stronger in bending, dramatically more resistant to moisture penetration, and dramatically more stable over its lifetime. This is why Viking ship planks could be made thin enough to flex with ocean waves without breaking. A sawn plank of the same thickness would have cracked in the first storm. It is also why those staved church timbers are still standing after 900 years. The wood was worked with the grain, not against it, and it has repaid that respect with centuries of service. The fifth method is about the axe itself, because the tool is everything in this kind of work, and the Viking approach to grinding and shaping an edge is different from what most of us are used to. A broadaxe for hewing is ground with a single bevel, typically between 20 and 25 degrees, on the side, facing away from the finished surface. The other side, The cheek that rides against the wood is dead flat or very slightly hollow. This is what allows the axe to take a controlled, consistent shaving rather than diving into the wood unpredictably. The Vikings and later Scandinavian craftsmen used a convex grind on many of their axe edges, which is sometimes called an appleseed grind. Instead of a flat bevel, the steel curves gently outward like the cross-section of an appleseed. This geometry is incredibly strong, resists chipping in hard oak, and slices through green wood with less effort than a flat grind because the convex shape pushes the wood apart as it cuts. Sharpening a convex grind is done freehand on a flat stone, rolling the bevel gently as you stroke. It takes practice, but once you have the feel for it, you can get a broadaxe sharp enough to shave arm hair, and that is exactly how sharp it needs to be for finishing passes. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I would like to admit. The first pattern is reaching for the sawmill or bandsaw as the default way to break down a log. Most of us do this because it is fast and it is what we know. But every time you run a log through a sawmill, you are severing grain fibers and creating weaker, less stable boards than the same log would have produced if it had been riven. I'm not saying sell your sawmill. I am saying that for projects where strength and longevity really matter, splitting first and hewing second will give you better material. The second pattern is treating all flat surfaces as a job for sandpaper. I sanded everything for 30 years, but a hewn surface that has been finished with a sharp broadaxe or a hand plane has a burnished quality that sanding destroys. The fibers are compressed and sealed rather than torn and scratched. Water beads on a hewn surface. It soaks into a sanded one. The third pattern is ignoring the grain direction when you dimension lumber. Most of us just run a board through the planer without thinking about which way the grain is oriented relative to the cut. The Viking approach of always working with the grain, never against it, applies just as much to a hand plane or a power planer as it does to a broadaxe. Pay attention to grain direction before every cut, and you will get cleaner results with less tear out. The fourth pattern is assuming old methods are slower and therefore impractical. An experienced hewer can flatten a face on an 8-foot oak timber in under 30 minutes. That is not much slower than setting up a sawmill and running the same log through, and the result is better wood. Sometimes the old way is not actually slower. It is just unfamiliar. The good news is once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, this is something I picked up from watching that Scandinavian fellow in Minnesota, and I have never seen it in any woodworking book I own. Before he split a single log, he would study the end grain and find the widest medullary rays. Then he would take a hatchet and make a small test split about 6 inches long right along one of those rays. He called it reading the log. That little test split told him everything he needed to know. If the split ran straight and true, the log was going to rive cleanly, and he could proceed with confidence. If the split curved or dove toward the center, it meant the grain was spiraling inside the log, and he would either adjust his approach or set that log aside for a different use. That 5-minute test saved him from wasting hours fighting a log that was never going to cooperate. I have been doing this on every log I split for the last 4 years, and it has saved me more frustration than any tool I have ever bought. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now, or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. Thank you for sticking with me through this one. These old methods have a lot to teach us if we are willing to slow down and pay attention. I will see you in the next one.